It was early June of 1788, and at this time, 8 of the former British colonies, now the newly created states of America, had ratified a national constitution, which meant that in order for said constitution to become the political law of the land, one more state had to ratify it. And so it was that all eyes turned to the state of New Hampshire, and in particular to the city of Exeter, in which the New Hampshire Constitutional Convention was busy for months deliberating whether or not to ratify the American Constitution. They'd been at the task for months. They'd convened in February, and the progress from then until April had been so difficult and contentious that at the time, a pious man, the president of the New Hampshire Constitutional Convention, John Langdon, actually proposed a day of fasting and humiliation in order to impress upon the delegates how important this task was. After a brief recess, the delegates were set to return in June to conclude their work and decide whether or not they would be the ones to push the United States of America over the edge into a constitutional republic. And it was, therefore, on June 5th, 1788, that John Langdon, the head of the Constitutional Convention's distant cousin, Samuel Langdon, at the time the most prominent minister in all of New Hampshire, and indeed, perhaps in all of the young, nascent United States of America, stepped to the podium of his church in Hampton Falls, New Hampshire, the most prominent parish in the country, or one of them, to deliver what would undoubtedly become the most important sermon of his life. The purpose of the sermon was to persuade his congregation, among whom numbered some of the most prominent citizens in New Hampshire, and several of whom were participants in the New Hampshire Constitutional Convention, of the important task before them, urging them, and Samuel Langdon was an ardent defender, the real arch defender of the Constitutional Project, to persuade them that adopting the Constitution would be the wise and virtuous choice. And I've given you, you all, well, in the Jewish community we call these source sheets. I'm to understand that Gentiles call these handouts. So you all have a handout. If you take a look at source number one, source number one is from the very opening words that Langdon delivered in his sermon, which was called "The Republic of the Israelites, an Example to the American States." And what Langdon says is the following: "As to everything excellent in their constitution of government, except what was peculiar to them as a nation separated to God from the rest of mankind, the Israelites may be considered as a pattern to the world in all ages. And from them we may learn what will exalt our character and what will depress and bring us to ruin. Let us therefore look over their constitution and laws, inquire into their practice, and observe how their prosperity and fame depended on their strict observance of the divine commands, both as to their government and religion." Langdon, in urging the adoption of the American Constitution, in setting out a vision for what this republic should be, turned not to Athens, not to Rome, not to ancient Mesopotamia, to the birth of civilization. He turned to the Hebrew Bible, and in particular, to the Israelites. The entire sermon bears not a single reference to any other text, tradition, or civilization. So my first question to you is why? Of all the models that the early American founders had before them, why the Bible? Number one. And number two, consider for a moment the political project that Langdon was urging upon his fellow citizens. It was a project that was setting up a constitutional republic. Now, for those of us who are familiar with the Bible, one of its most politically salient features is that it is not a constitutional republic. In fact, there is a particular political institution that is deeply, deeply ingrained within the warp and weave of the Bible, and that is monarchy. If you're a biblical political project, you probably should have a king. And yet it was that very political institution that the United States of America was born to reject. So the question that I have for you was, let's say we can figure out why Langdon is so concerned to pattern the United States of America as a political and moral project upon the Hebrew Bible. Why would he assume that this would be in any way feasible? In other words, wasn't Langdon wrong? Isn't this just transparently incorrect? Where would Langdon get the idea, an idea that his audience would in fact find uncontroversial? Where would Langdon get the idea that a republic of the sort that he and his compatriots wanted to set up was in any way faithful to the very text that he revered? Now, in order to answer the first question, we're going to have to rewind a bit in history, though not as much as we'll have to rewind to answer the second question. To answer the first question, we're going to have to rewind to what normally people would, well, we're going to have to rewind essentially to the Renaissance. The Renaissance sees a passionate rebirth of interest in the text of the Bible itself. For very many centuries, the Bible was simply not a text that you read unless you were a specialist. Now, typically, people, I think your average Joe on the street, to the extent they still think about serious things, which is increasingly uncommon these days, but to the extent that your average Joe on the street does think about the Renaissance, the medieval period, if you ask them, like, where does the idea that people should read the Bible on a normal basis in order to construct political and moral order out of it, so people would typically say the Reformation. The truth is that the serious project of, and they associated with Martin Luther and translating the Bible, the truth is the project of very seriously reading the Bible, going back to the Bible as a source of personal, political, and institutional virtue actually goes back to the Renaissance, and in particular to a hotbed of biblical scholarship that takes place in the city of Rome, and particularly in the Vatican. It's there, in fact, that some of the most interesting collaborations between Jews and, what at the time you would have just called Christians, were going on. One in particular that I find really fascinating is one of the great medieval commentators of the Jewish tradition. If you were to open up a rabbinic Bible today, to this very day, you'd see his words printed there amongst the other 5 or 6 most prominent Jewish biblical commentators in all of history. It was a man by the name of Rabbi Obadiah Sforno, Rabbi Ovadia Sforno. Rabbi Ovadia Sforno is one of the greats of the tradition. Any person schooled in Jewish letters will be able to tell you his name and will be able to identify his commentary. Rabbi Sforno lived, in Jewish tradition, we sort of affectionately refer to him as the Sforno. The Sforno was a denizen of Rome, and it was there that when the most prominent lawyer in all of Europe, a devout Catholic throughout his life, and eventually an opponent of the Reformation, though he was sympathetic to many of its original characters, a man by the name of Johannes Reuchlin came to meet with the Pope and several of the cardinals with whom he was in academic conversation. Reuchlin became deeply intrigued with biblical Hebrew. He would go on to publish the first textbook on biblical Hebrew in the entirety of European history. He was a master of biblical studies. He actually carried on a daily study session with the Sforno for almost a year. They went to buy books together, and in private correspondences to their respective loved ones spoke very highly and almost lovingly of each other in a way that bespoke real intellectual camaraderie. So you have this project of going back to the Bible for political insight. And then eventually, as the wars of religion begin to rage across the European continent, it becomes clearer and clearer to societies across Europe, Catholic, Protestant, anything else, that if we're going to construct a virtuous order, an order that is not only morally upright, but also politically sustainable, the best way to do so would be to create a godly political order rooted in the Word of God. And it's at this point, therefore, that some of the greatest minds, really all of the greatest minds in Europe, and certainly in the Anglo tradition, begin to turn to the Bible itself to figure out, okay, if we were to construct a political order on the basis of the political order that God commands be set up in the Bible, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy, which is essentially an entire book about what happens when you want to create a society from scratch in the Promised Land, how do we do it? Now, the problem was the widespread and scholarly study of the Bible was, outside of the context of a very small number of people, a relatively new field in the history of European letters. And therefore, there was a great need for commentary on what is otherwise a very opaque, seemingly, and difficult book. And of course, at this time in Europe, very few people on either side of the wars of religion trusted each other. So what was needed urgently was a source of commentary on the Bible, particularly the Hebrew Bible, that would be produced by people who could read the work in its original language, who had a long history of having interpreted it, and who could not be accused of having a horse in the race of Catholics versus Protestants. The most readily available, in fact, the only available example in all of Europe for someone who fit that bill were the Jews. I'll say, you don't have to, I'm not going to make a room of Catholics scream the Jews. It was the Jews. And so what transpires over the course of the next almost 2.5 centuries, in the 16th century, in the 17th century, all the way into the early years of the 18th century, is an explosion of Christian Hebraic scholarship. It is a sight to behold for those who study this period of history. During this time, all of the greatest works of the Jewish intellectual tradition are translated into the great scholarly languages of Europe, most prominently Latin, but eventually French and English and some other languages as well. Works like the Mishnah, which is the earliest rabbinic work in the Jewish tradition, the Talmud, the rabbinical exegetical commentaries and homiletical commentaries in the Bible called the Midrash. We'll encounter one later. All of the works of the great medieval scholars, from Maimonides to Halevi to Rabbi David Kimchi to Rashi, and on and on and on. The great works of the Jewish mystical tradition, the Zohar, the Sefer Yetzirah, all of these works are translated, and all of the greatest thinkers of the European tradition begin to pore over them and begin to extract knowledge from them about how to create a virtuous biblical political order. And the greatest minds in Europe are at this task. Names that are household names to those in this room who study either political philosophy or political theology: Thomas Hobbes, John Milton, John Locke, Francis Bacon. I mean, go down the line. These are all political and Christian Hebraists. Now, what this project introduces into Europe politically, and eventually, as we'll see, makes its way to the shores of the New World, are two things that had not appeared before in European political tradition, that have absolutely no precedent until the advent of the Christian Hebraic tradition. The first is what we call, what historians call monarchical exclusivism. Monarchical exclusivism is the idea that not only may you have a king, if that fits the society you're hoping to construct, as Aristotle said, but that actually you must have a king. You are only allowed to have a king. Where would Europeans get that idea from? There's no precedent anywhere in Aristotle or in any of his contemporaries. Where would Europeans get that idea? Well, they found it in the Talmud. In Tractate Sanhedrin, the rabbis teach that there were three laws incumbent upon the Israelites immediately upon their entry into the land, not necessarily in any particular order, although that's the subject of dispute. But the three laws were destroying the Amalekites, building the temple, and appointing a king. And it's at this point that political thinkers in the West discover this text, and they say, well, when Deuteronomy says you can appoint a king, it doesn't mean you will appoint a king as a prediction. It doesn't mean you may appoint a king. It's not permission. It's you must appoint a king, which is a valid way of reading the biblical Hebrew. We'll see it in a moment. One of the great monarchical thinkers of this period, Claude de Salmasius, he goes by the pen name Salmasius in source number 2, writes in his Defensio Regia, and this becomes a favorite text of monarchs across Europe. He says, the rabbis of the Jews teach that there were 3 obligations for the Israelites, which it was necessary for them to fulfill after they were brought to the Holy Land: to constitute a king over themselves, to eliminate the Amalekites, and to build the temple. So, This, in short, answers our first question, but makes our second question much more difficult. In answer to our first question, why is Samuel Langdon appealing to the Bible as the source of political order? It's because he is the heir to the Christian Hebraic tradition that flowers in the European continent and eventually, particularly in England, and whose most ardent disciples make their way to the New World. Langdon is heir to a tradition that sees the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, as the source for political order, and he and all of his colleagues understood that in creating the United States of America, their only hope for creating such a project that would actually last was to pattern it upon what the great European thinkers of the time called the Hebrew Republic of the Book of Deuteronomy. The problem, however, as you can tell from Salmasius, is that, as we said earlier, Langdon seems at first glance to be wrong. I mean, it certainly seems like you ought to have a king if you want to create a biblical republic. And if Salmasius is right about the view in the Talmud, it may in fact be that you have no choice but to have a king. Monarchical exclusivism. So where does Langdon get off saying that we should create a constitutional republic on the basis of the Israelites? Now, in order to understand the biblical political order, how to read it properly, and at the very least how Langdon would have read it, and therefore understanding the tradition in which we Americans stand, and of which we in this room, I believe, are essential stewards, it's important for us to inquire as to the beginnings of biblical political wisdom. Now, typically when people think about where politics come from, again, if we go back to our average Joe on the street, who's already interested in the Renaissance, and we ask him now to expand his horizons a little bit to political theory, your average Joe on the street might say, well, if you want to begin a discussion about politics, we can start with debating communism versus capitalism versus monarchy versus republicanism. Or he might say, we can start by debating whether we should have a bicameral legislature, whether we should have a separation of powers, whether we should have an independent judiciary. The problem is, the former are forms of government, the latter are institutions of government, but all of those things are premised on a political vision. And in all the great works of political theory, everything always actually begins not with theory about institutions, not with theories about forms of government, but rather actually with a theory about the origins of man, the origins of human beings. Think, for example, about our very own political order here in the United States. The first and greatest of our political formulations in the Declaration of Independence begins not with a theory of government, not with a form of government, not with proposals about institutions of government. It begins, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It begins with a theory of humanity. It is therefore no mistake that the Bible, too, though it's a political work in the grandest and broadest sense, also begins with the origins of humanity. But before we even get there, we're going to start actually a little bit before the Bible. Take a look at source number 3. A mistake that I think we tend to make about the Bible is that we treat it as if it is and there actually is an expression of this in the Jewish tradition, and it's a beautiful one, and it deserves unpacking perhaps at a different time. But we tend to think of the Bible as sort of like a work of first principles. In the words of one particular Jewish tradition, of the blueprint out of which the world was created. And it is that, in a sense. But it's also important to recognize that the Bible, as God gives it to us, is not a work of first principles at all. It doesn't begin with a series of inductive proofs. It doesn't begin with a series of sort of axiomatic statements about the universe. It begins with a flight out of Mesopotamia. the most well-established civilization on the planet. It begins with Abraham. We'll get to Genesis in a moment, Genesis 1 in a moment. But Genesis 12, the beginning of the story of Israel, begins with a flight from civilization. Exodus, which tells the beginning of the nation of Israel, similarly begins with a flight from a well-established civilization, with a flight from Egypt. The Bible, in other words, is not a book of first principles, it's a book of critique. It is a reaction to the great man-made imperial powers of the world. It is a critique of power. And so if we want to understand the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, before the beginning of the story of Israel, it is likewise critical for us to understand precisely what it is, or what it was, that the Bible was critiquing. To wit, if we're going to read the Bible's account, the true account of creation, we need to understand what it was the Bible knew that everybody else at the time was thinking. In reaction to what, in other words, is my question about the book of Genesis? As an alternative to what? So if you take a look at source number 3 gives us what was, at the time, at least as we can tell archaeologically, the most popular creation account in Mesopotamia. I say that because it's the creation account of which by far the most copies survive in the archaeological record. It was composed probably within a generation or two removed from Hammurabi, whose code we'll examine in just a moment. The Epic of Atrahasis gives us an account of the origins of man, and it's worth our while to ruminate upon it for a moment. I've given you just a couple of excerpts here from the very beginning of the text. It begins, when gods were man. Now, I don't know, there may be some Akkadian speakers or readers in the room. I may be the only one, but there may be some in here. But for those, if you are not, what this means in context is, well, I should amend. I'm not an Akkadian speaker. I'm an Akkadian reader. But when gods were like man, although the fact that it translates very smoothly as when gods were man is certainly telling. When gods were man, when gods were like men, they did forced labor. They bore drudgery. Great indeed was the drudgery of the gods. The forced labor was heavy, the misery too much. The 7 great Anuna gods were burdening the Igigi gods with forced labor. What the heck is happening here? With all due respect, when gods were slaves, what does that even mean? I mean, for those of us who are raised in the Western tradition, the idea that God would be enslaved by something above, like, it makes very little sense. This, however, was the most intuitive way that anybody in the ancient Mesopotamian world would have thought about the cosmos. The cosmos, in other words, was just a reflection of life on earth. It was a deeply hierarchical place. And in heaven, much like on earth, there were lower class citizens and there were higher class citizens. There were slaves and there were masters. And the slave gods, the Igigi gods, were forced to bear all of the toil and drudgery that the Anuna gods, the supreme gods, foisted upon them. What happens at this point is a labor strike. The Igigi gods decide, we've had enough. We're not going to spend our entire immortal existence slaving away for the Anuna gods. And they demand that they be given leave from their work, that they be released from their chains. The Anuna gods at first panic because this threatens to disrupt their lives of serenity and leisure. But then they come up with a solution. They summoned and asked the goddess, the midwife of the gods, wise Mami, will you be the birth goddess, creatress of mankind? Create a human being that he bear the yoke. Let man assume the drudgery of God. And so they slaughtered Auilu, who had the inspiration, one of the gods, in their assembly. They killed a god. Nintu mixed clay with Auilu's flesh and blood. The same God and man were thoroughly mixed in the clay. From the flesh of the God, the spirit remained. It would make the living know its sign. So why is man created? Man is created to be the slaves that the Igigi gods had eventually refused to be. Man is created so that the gods can safely ignore them as much as they possibly can. Man is created, humanity is created to bear the burdens that the gods themselves refused to bear, and now the gods, all of them, can go on living lives of leisure. Now, you may recognize in this account certain echoes of what we're familiar with in the biblical creation account. For example, what's one example? Clay. Man is shaped from clay. Now, man is shaped from clay. That clay is somehow imbued with divinity, but it's there that the similarities stop. Take a look at the creation account. I've given you source number 4. Now, I've called this text Bereshit. That is, for those of you who are familiar with the Jewish tradition, so we have the books of the Hebrew Bible, but we give them our own superhero names. Typically the way it works in the Jewish tradition is that the names that we give to the biblical books are either the first or the first prominent word in a book. And the very first word in the book of Genesis is the word Bereshit, which means in the beginning. So this is the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis tells us, so God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being. Here we see an entirely different vision for humanity. Even the similarities express the difference. Here, man is created, humanity is created, not merely to serve God, not to give God relief from his burdens, but as a partner with God, to exercise dominion over creation in partnership with the Creator. In fact, in the image of the Creator. And whereas in the Epic of Atrahasis, man is created from clay and imbued with the blood of a dead God to remind humanity of its place, in Genesis, man is created from mere lowly clay, but then imbued with the breath of the one living God to remind humanity of its potential. In Mesopotamia, man, like the gods upon whom they were patterned and whose image they were formed, were slaves. In the Bible, all human beings are created equal. Now, once we've gotten for ourselves a sense of the Bible's understanding of the origins of man, its theory of the origins of man, we can then proceed to ask, okay, much as the American tradition would much later do, now that we have a sense of the truths that we hold self-evident, what sort of political institutions should we recommend on that basis? So let's take, for example, the issue under discussion here, and that is the question of monarchy, of kingship. Should we have a king? And if so, what should the king do? It happens to be, similarly here, we'll have to ask, well, as an alternative to what? In Mesopotamia, for example, the king was not only a well-established institution, it was a universal institution. And while the models of kingship in the ancient world varied with local and national context and regional context, there are certain similarities that are, as far as we can tell from the available evidence, universal, and therefore it's, I think, worthwhile to generalize about them. We're going to take a look at two sources very quickly, just to give you a sense. These are, you'll have to take my word for it that these are representative, but feel free to excavate the evidence yourself. The first source we're going to look at is source number 5 here, from the Asher prism of Tiglath-Pileser, from the second millennium. And what we're going to do is read it carefully and figure out on this basis what is one of, or what are the jobs, what is the job of the king on the basis of this text. The Asher prism tells us, from ancient Babylonia, ancient Assyria, I destroyed the lands of Saraush and Amaush, which from ancient times had not known submission. I conquered their cities, took their gods, brought out their booty, possessions, and property. What role is the king playing here in this text? The king is a conqueror. The king is in charge of the armies. The king's job is to lead conquest. When the kingdom goes to war, the king is in charge. Okay. What else does a king do? Take a look at source number 6, which is the Code of Hammurabi. You can see the text on the other side. The Code of Hammurabi tells us, then Anu, and this is from the prologue of the Code when Hammurabi is sort of speaking in the first person, then Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, and enlighten the land, to further the well-being of mankind. Hammurabi the prince called of Belamai, making riches and increase, enriching the temple centers of Nippur and Dur-Ilu beyond compare, sublime patron of Akur's cult, who was reestablished Eridu, another temple city, and purified the worship of Apsu. Okay, there are two things here. What are the two jobs of the king in the Code of Hammurabi? Excellent, moral leader, the lawgiver in this case, right? The king legislates, the king gives laws. Right, judge, right? In other words, the king has sort of a legal law-giving role, and he's the head of the cult, right? He's the head of the religion. The king is in charge of the state religion. Okay. Now, if you were to look at monarchy across the ancient world, from Mesopotamia to Egypt, you will see that kings in all of those places all had these three characteristics. These are sort of the three universal characteristics of monarchy in the ancient world. In charge of conquest, lawgiver, head of the cult. Now, take a look at the Bible, source number 7. Devarim is what we call the book of Deuteronomy. The first two words of the book are Ela Devarim. These are the words that God spoke, that Moses spoke to the Jewish people in the plains of Moab. So Devarim tells us about a king. Here's what we know, and this is it. When you've come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and then you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me, set over you a king whom the Lord your God will choose. From among your brethren you shall set a king over you. You're not permitted to put a foreigner over you who's not of your brethren, but once you've done this, he must not acquire many horses for himself or return the people to Egypt in order to acquire more horses, since the Lord has said to you, you must never return that way again. And he must not acquire many wives for himself, or else his heart will turn away. Also, silver and gold he must not acquire in great quantity for himself. And it shall be, when he sits upon the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself a copy of this law on a scroll in the presence of the priests, the Levites, and it shall remain with him, and he shall read in it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to fear the Lord his God, diligently observing all the words of this law and these statutes, neither exalting himself above other members of the community, nor turning aside from the commandment, either to the right or to the left, so that he may prolong his days in his kingdom, he and his children in the midst of Israel. Okay. First of all, before we go any further, this seems strange in the context of another biblical text. This sounds like, listen, either you may have a king, you must have a king, it's good to have a king, certainly you're allowed to have a king. For those of you who have read 1 Samuel, the 8th chapter, and subsequent chapters, you'll be familiar with what happens when the Israelites ask for a king in precisely the manner that's described here. What is the reaction of Samuel the prophet? Samuel's reaction is to say, you are betraying me. This is horrible. And God interrupts Samuel and says, no, they're not betraying you. They're betraying me. They're rejecting me. I have been rejected by the Israelites. This is a horrible thing. God is deeply upset with the Jewish people for asking for a king. So how do we square Deuteronomy on the one hand and Samuel on the other hand? That brings us back to the text in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy tells us, what is the role of the king? Let's go one by one through the classic ancient Near Eastern roles. Is the king in charge of the armies, in charge of conquest? How do we know, one way or another? Tell me. So don't get horses. That's a good answer, but it's so simple. It's deceptively simple. How do you know the king is not in charge of conquest? Even before that, where in these verses do we know? Does it tell us the king is not in charge of conquest? What's the setup for this entire verse? The conditional phrase. When you've come into the land that your Lord God is giving you, and you've taken possession of it and settled in it, when you've already finished the period of conquest, then you appoint a king. The king has nothing to do with conquest. The king is not the head of the conquest process. He's not the head of the armies. Number 2, is the king here given any role in the state religion, let alone being the leader of the state religion? No. There is one religious figure or institution that appears in this text, the Levites, and the king is responsible to them. Number 3, is the king the lawgiver? Does the king give the laws? No. The king is responsible to the laws, does not give them. Certainly doesn't make them up, as Hammurabi does, albeit being entrusted by Bel and so forth to do it. King doesn't even record the laws. The king has no role at all in the legislative process or in the judicial process. In fact, if you look at this text, what you will see is a series of negative clauses, exclusively, with one exception at the end. All this text doesn't enumerate the powers of the king. It just says a king may not do this, may not do that, may not do a third thing. What's the only responsibility, positive responsibility, that the king has? Observe the words of the law. For those of you who've read Deuteronomy before, or can at least guess based on what Deuteronomy's vibe is, who else has the responsibility to observe the laws of God and study them regularly? Everybody. Every single Israelite has the exact same responsibility. Now, you may be asking yourself, well then, what's the point of having a king? The answer is, exactly. This, in fact, is the other great rabbinic tradition that comments on the institution of kingship. Take a look in source number 8. The great ancient rabbinic exegetical commentary on monarchy tells us, the rabbis said, the rabbis sort of imagine a dialogue between God and Israel. God said to Israel, my son, I intended you to be free of kings. Cherus min hamalchios in Hebrew. I intended you to be free of kings, as it says, a wild donkey used to the desert. This is a verse in Jeremiah describing God's relationship with Israel. Just as this donkey grew up in the desert and had no fear of royalty, so did I plan that you should have no fear of royalty upon yourselves. But you did not so plan. Rather, as the verse continues in Jeremiah, the donkey snuffeth up wind in her pleasure. And wind, ruach in Hebrew, is nothing but kingship. Hence the verse, and it brings a proof text from the Hebrew of the following verse in Psalms, do not trust in princes. Al tiftachu b'ndivim. Do not trust in princes. As Rabbi Simon said in the name of Rabbi Joshua, the son of Levi, any who trusts in God merits to be like him. But any who trusts in idolatry, which is his term for kingship, for monarchy, any who trusts in idolatry condemns himself to become like it. The notion that asking for a monarch is in some very serious fashion a rejection of God himself is precisely what the book of Samuel tells us. How then do you reconcile the book of Deuteronomy with the book of Samuel? The answer for the rabbis in this tradition is that the Israelites, like all of us, are imperfect people. And like all human beings, we are born to make mistakes. And we're born to choose wrong. Now, God makes allowances for us to choose wrong. And when we do choose wrong, there are consequences, but path dependencies. But ultimately, you're not supposed to ask for a king. But if you do ask for a king, then what the book of Samuel tells us is that you'll be punished. And what's your punishment as a society for asking to be ruled over by another human being, by a person of flesh and blood? What's your punishment? You get exactly what you ask for. So where does that leave us with respect to biblical political order? Well, what the Bible seems to tell us is that, first of all, human beings are born free, and as such, and if you want to understand what it means to be made in the image of your Creator, you should look no farther than man's freedom. Man has the ability to choose a relationship with God, and God's expectation of humanity is that humanity should partner with God in exercising dominion over the world. What that means for a political order, as such, is that political order should be much like it was in the rest of the ancient world, a mirror of heaven. But whereas in the rest of the world, that meant a proliferation of injustice, for the Bible, that meant a divine society in which no person was greater than any other, in which each human being was responsible for the virtue of society, in which, in response to the question, who will lead us and who will make sure that we can be better than we are? Who will ensure that our society is good and is virtuous and is moral? The answer that the Bible gives to that question is the person responsible for that is you. You are responsible for that. There are times where you may be tempted to rely on others, and it's understandable. And you can, in fact, create an entire trajectory of history on the basis of that misapprehension. But at the end of the day, God's expectation for us is the very expectation that he sets up in Genesis and consummates in Deuteronomy, which is that we are to be a society in which people are free and are expected to use that freedom to choose virtue and are responsible for the choices that they make. The notion that depending upon another human being for political virtue is in some fashion an act of idolatry doesn't remain sequestered within the rabbinic tradition. In response to Salmasius discovering the source from Tractate Sanhedrin that we referred to earlier about kingship, probably the greatest defender of republics in the history of the West, and certainly in the English tradition, John Milton of Paradise Lost fame, discovered this very source that we just read. And after quoting it extensively in his reply to Salmasius, which was circulated widely throughout Europe, he wrote, "In order to show all that you have failed to prove in any way from the works of the Hebrews what you had undertaken to prove in this chapter, Salmasius, you freely admit that some of their rabbis deny that their fathers should have recognized any king but God, though such a king was given to punish them. I follow the opinion of these rabbis." It's a remarkable statement. This notion, the comparison between monarchs and idols, was an important feature of perhaps the most important literary work in the early days of the American Revolution, and that is the work of Common Sense by Thomas Paine. Now, Thomas Paine was an irascible bore, and his lack of sophistication and education irked many of his critics among the founding fathers themselves. No less than John Adams took one look at Common Sense and said, "You plagiarized this entire thing from John Milton." To which Thomas Paine gleefully responded that he had done exactly that and was proud of it. And so it was that you could very fairly say that it was the rabbis in collaboration with Christian theologians who invented the American Revolution. And I think that's something of which we should be deeply proud. Now, the question, therefore, is, okay, so we've set up a biblical political order, and a biblical political order requires freedom. And by that I mean a political system that refuses hierarchy and insists that no human being is qualitatively greater than any other human being by being born to some sort of station. But what role does that leave for virtue? Remember, after all, that what Genesis reminds us is that the entire purpose of a society grounded in freedom is so that human beings should be free to choose to do what they ought, not just what they wish. To partner with God, to remember their responsibilities to God. Is there room for this in the American political order? To which, no less than our first president, George Washington, responded in his farewell address in 1796, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens." There's a moment in the early history of this country during which Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were tasked with crafting a seal for the United States of America. And what they proposed, though it was rejected for totally insane reasons, but the seal that they proposed featured the splitting of the Red Sea and Moses directing the people across the sea. And while to me that's deeply inspiring, and I wish that their view had prevailed over the atrocity of the weirdo pyramid that we have now, Had I been asked, I would rather have proposed a seal depicting the revelation at Mount Sinai. Because what Jefferson and Franklin wanted was an emblem of freedom. And they rightly looked to the story of the Exodus for symbolism. But what's crucial to understand in the narrative arc of Exodus is that the freedom of the flight from Egypt is a negative freedom. It's a revolt. It's a slave revolt, as it should be. It's God breaking the chains of the downtrodden. But God doesn't merely expect us to run away from bondage, to flee evil. God expects us to choose freely to journey towards virtue, towards Sinai. Sinai is the emblem of a people affirmatively, positively, freely choosing to covenant with God. And it's in that respect that a political order can ultimately be founded on virtue. Now, I tell you all of this today because if we're thinking about the historical and moral trajectory of Jewish-Catholic relations, it is, quite frankly, a difficult journey. But I will tell you a story that happened just a few days ago. And I'm going to try to get through it. You're going to have to excuse me if I can't. In the wake of the terrorist attacks in Israel on October 7th, the gruesome nature of which I don't need to rehearse, both for your sanity and mine, I was impacted, the least of anybody, but nevertheless, on a personal level, because my sister was scheduled to get married the week afterwards in Jerusalem. And I was supposed to officiate as the rabbi at her ceremony. And I could not. All the flights were canceled. And as I watched on Zoom, my sister was supposed to get married in a hall, and she and my now brother-in-law could not because the hall had been made unavailable. It was requisitioned. So they got married in a front yard. And the aisle that my sister walked down was a street. And as she walked down the aisle, every single person lining the street, total strangers, religious, secular, of Middle Eastern origin, of European origin, of North African origin, everybody came outside to sing and to dance my sister down the aisle. This may strike you as an odd scene, but a young man living in the Judean desert 2,600 years ago foresaw it as clearly as I did watching it, and that man was Jeremiah. Jeremiah wrote, standing amidst the flames of a destroyed Jerusalem, sacked by the Babylonians, once more in the streets of Judah and the streets of Jerusalem that are desolate will be heard the sounds of mirth and the sounds of rejoicing, the sounds of the bridegroom and the sounds of the bride. Now, I couldn't be there, but Andrew was. My friend from Franciscan was in Israel at the time. He was with my people in their time of need. And he walked by my sister's wedding. He actually saw it as he was walking out of the old city of Jerusalem. And it struck me for the first time, though I knew it intellectually, I hadn't felt it ever emotionally. When Isaiah says that all the nations of the world shall stream to Jerusalem, and they'll ascend the mountain of God and go up to the house of Jacob, and they will ask, teach us in your ways and let us walk in your paths. For the law shall go forth from Zion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. That means not the nations in some abstract sense. That means all the nations of the world. That means everyone in this room. And in that moment, I realized I don't have the permission. I don't have the authority to forget on behalf of centuries upon centuries of Jews the nature of the relationship between our people, our communities. I'm a nobody. I just don't have the authority to do that. But what I can do is bequeath to my children and their children the memories of the friendship that someone like Andrew showed to me in that moment, and the friendship that I know all of you are eager to show to us in this moment, then we're eager, therefore, to show to you as well. I'll conclude with a word from the book of the Song of Songs. Perhaps my favorite verse in there. You're not allowed to have such a thing, but were you? It's a verse that is memorialized by one of the great, probably the great Orthodox Jewish theologian of the 20th century, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, in his masterwork of Zionist theology. It's Kol Dodi Dofek. The woman in Song of Songs says, "Hark, it's the sound of my beloved knocking. God's knocking on the door." God doesn't open doors for us, but God knocks. And now we open the door. This is the sound of God knocking, a gathering like this. And now it's our responsibility, every single one of us in this room, to open the door. It's not merely we individuals in this room and our children and our children's children who are counting on it. It's the very health of this society, of whose political tradition we are the stewards. It's the very political and moral health of Western civilization, upon whose, or rather at whose foundation, at whose root sit the very traditions that we hold dear and that we are responsible for teaching to the world. And it is all of humanity whose hope for the future ultimately lies in the visions of Jeremiah and the visions of Isaiah that I at least had the merit to see, at least in some small way, brought to life in the last week. And so I can't thank you enough for spending this time together with me, with everyone who spoke in this spot over the last 2 or 3 days. And I welcome your friendship and I extend mine in turn. Thank you so much for having me.